So let's jump ahead to 1949, the Soviet atomic bomb, a pivotal moment in 20th century history. So this is part of the Cold War. So again, let's take a moment to define the Cold War. The term comes from a famous journalist, Walter Lippmann, in 1947, sort of trying to find a name for what's happening between the US and the Soviet Union. Basically, the competitive struggle between those two nations it started before 1945, but we can effectively say it really gets going after World War II and lasts all the way up until the Soviet Union disintegrates. And this struggle takes many forms. It's an ideological, rhetorical struggle that makes its way into speeches and so forth. It's also a diplomatic struggle in global diplomacy and the United Nations, lining up nations against each other in alliances. It's an economic battle to see which system is going to prevail. And it's also a military battle, but an indirect one. We're going to use proxy wars and proxy nations just to fight this one out. Just relatively quickly, Americans have feared and loathed communism for a really long time, way back into the 19th century. This is a cartoon from the 1880s. And so when Americans thought of communism, they thought of a system, they were well schooled for 70 years before World War II to think of communism as anti-religious, anti-family, anti-individual, anti-private property, anti-democratic, and inherently violent. And essentially, if you flip that over, take off all the antis, it's basically, that's what Americans think of themselves, right? Religious, family-centered, individualist, and so on. So it's kind of the antithesis of what Americans thought of themselves. That said, war makes for strange bedfellows. So the United States and the Soviet Union, which did not get along before World War II, join forces in World War II to defeat Nazi Germany. But that relationship is temporary. There's a long history of mistrust. The United States was leery of Joseph Stalin because he signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact, basically an alliance during the beginning chapters of World War II. And shortly after that, Soviets invaded their neighbors, basically seen as communist opportunism. Soviet distrust on their part, the Soviets had reason to distrust the US and allies. The United States and Great Britain refused to open a second front in the war. Stalin pleaded for them to do so because he was taking such a hit from the Nazi invasion. And he believed that they didn't open that second front because they wanted him to be damaged. They wanted Russia to be weakened. The Allies also signed a separate peace with Italy in 1943, excluding the Soviet Union. So again, he's feeling snubbed and feeling like they're kind of conspiring against him. And then in 1945, the US drops an atomic bomb, which was both to end the war, but many people believed, and there's a lot of scholarship that backs this up, that at least one of the intents of the dropping of the bomb was to send a message to Stalin and the Soviet Union that we have the bomb, you better behave, or you better check your ambitions. At the end of World War II, the goals of both sides are pretty straightforward. The Soviet Union says, we've paid a huge price in this war. We have the right to demand friendly governments along our border with Eastern Europe. And we also demand a permanently divided Germany. Germany has wreaked havoc in the 20th century in Europe on 2 occasions, and the only way to settle that is to divide Germany. The United States is not interested in either of those solutions. The United States sees the goal of post-war Europe as rebuilding both the East and the West as capitalist democracies, which by definition, of course, would be more friendly to the West, to the United States, and in Stalin's mind, inherently hostile to him. Tensions rise in the 1940s. Churchill invokes that image of the Iron Curtain in 1946, that Stalin is tightening his grip on Eastern European countries. The US response to what is seen as Soviet aggression is the Truman Doctrine, 1947. And basically, in so many words, Truman says, it is our job and our obligation to assist countries that are being actively undermined by armed insurrections or by meddling by Soviet or communist forces or communist influences. And so we will do this militarily with arms. We will also do it through economic policies like the Marshall Plan. And the word that kind of encapsulates the Truman Doctrine is containment. We're not going to try to defeat the Soviet Union or defeat communism everywhere we see it. We're just going to try to bottle it up, and because that's about as good as we can possibly pull off. And the atomic monopoly of the United States, which began in 1945, that's key to to containment, because we have that as kind of an ace in the hole to keep the Soviets in check for 4 years, and that's it. We are absolutely stunned in August of 1949 when it's clear that the Soviet Union has developed a bomb, and there's a tremendous amount of finger pointing, and who missed this, and we know what that's like in contemporary times with international failures. Just weeks later, China falls to Mao and the revolutionaries. Another total Cold War stunner, utterly unexpected that our ally and the Chiang Kai-shek government in China would simply collapse. We knew there was a revolution on or a civil war on, but we didn't expect China to fall. And so how did we miss the bomb? And then who lost China? Two really important questions that are rocketing around Washington. And then just a few months later, in June of 1950, North Korea again completely stuns the United States, surprises them by invading South Korea. So in the American mind, communism is on the march, and we are absolutely positively caught flat-footed. So we issue a new kind of, we reorient our Cold War posture. The famous document, which some of you may have heard of, is called NSC 68, National Security Council paper number 68. It issued in 1950, and it calls for the US to respond to all communist or Soviet provocations, not just pick and choose. We're going to go after all of them. We're going to engage in unilateralism if necessary, because we can't rely on our European allies always to back us. And we're going to increase defense spending astronomically. And this is a really important point, because this is a massive departure from our historical way of thinking about the military. This is something, if you're any originalists in the crowd, this is one of the many things that originalists often want to overlook, which is that if you believe in originalism, like going back to the vision of the founders, you would have to dismantle the US military almost down to nothing, because that's how we did it. We would have a small military because big militaries threaten democracy. That's where Napoleons come from. That's where Caesars come from. And so to maintain the republic, we have to have a small military. When we get in a war, we build up a military, we win the war, and then we dismantle the military. And you can see that happening in this slide, right? Tiny military in 1940, massive military in 1945, heading back towards tiny military in 1950, but with the Soviet bomb and the fall of China and the invasion of North Korea, invading South Korea, that triggers a military spending. And you can, here's the summation of like what the founders thought, right? Here's Madison on this very question. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Well, starting in the 50s, we will be in continual warfare, Cold War warfare, and sometimes real warfare, and it's going to present a big challenge. The man who presides over the building of the military-industrial complex has qualms about it as he leaves office in 1961. President Eisenhower warns the nation about this problem, this tension between republicanism and militarism, and he leaves that for successive presidents to deal with. A second impact of the Soviet detonation is rising fear. And you can see this, many of you have seen these images before, but the idea of a spreading communism going across the globe and the Western ally, United States and Western allies being simply caught flat-footed. Fear of the bomb, another important one that there are people in this audience right now, I'm sure, who did some duck and cover drills when they were growing up. I was born in 1963, so I think I escaped it just by a little bit, but it was a palpable fear. And I remember in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, it was a major fear and a major talking point, of course, for Americans wondering about whether we would have a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. The U.S. civil defense and the U.S. government tried to mitigate that fear by saying we could survive it. We be vigilant. So they issued manuals. They also encouraged Americans to build bomb shelters. Thousands of Americans built bomb shelters in the early 1960s into the 70s. Sometimes just outfitting their basement, or sometimes like this one on the right, building a full-on bomb shelter. We know that popular culture fed another kind of fear, not just the fear of the bomb, but fear of communist subversion. This was a major theme in American movies, American pop culture. You can see two sensational examples here. The Red Menace, another one from 1949, spreading the notion that we not only have to fear the invasion from outside, but invasion from within. Fear of spies. So we know that it's not just fear of spies, there are actual spies. So Alger Hiss was convicted of passing information on to Soviets in 1950, right in the middle of what's happening here, this kind of pivotal moment of 49-50. And Julius Rosenberg is arrested in the spring of 1950. His wife will be subsequently arrested as well, and the two of them will be executed. So fear of spies, but actual spy cases being cracked. This paves the way for another impact of the Soviet bomb, which is the rise of McCarthy. Notice the date. He gives his famous communists on the march, communists in the State House, in the State Department speech in February of 1950. He's an obscure senator from Wisconsin. He will rocket to power and influence and really kind of lead a reign of terror in many people's minds for the next 4 years until 1954. But this is the speech where he says, I have in my hand the envelope with 205 known members of the Communist Party who are working in the State Department. So this paves the way for that period we know as McCarthyism. It also paves the way for, as we build up our nuclear arsenal, the Soviets do as well, and we have a near nuclear catastrophe in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thankfully averted, but historians are pretty unanimous in their agreement that this is the closest we ever got to a full-on nuclear exchange. It also explains in some ways why we blundered into Vietnam. Vietnam may or may not have been a priority had we not been in this kind of ramped up phase of the Cold War. And yet, despite what Lyndon Johnson says in this quotation, not about, we're not going to send American boys to fight in Asia for Asian boys, look at the numbers here. By 1968, the United States has 586,000 Americans in a place called Vietnam that most Americans could still not find on a map. I mean, that is a vivid example of the kind of way the Americans were thinking about this aggressive containment policy that came out of the Soviet detonation of the bomb. Of course, we all know how Vietnam ends, and we also know how it ends, especially because we've seen this photo endlessly in the last week, 10 days, because of what's happening in Afghanistan. There are parallels there, to be sure. The fear of the bomb and it leads to an anti-nuclear movement globally, but also here in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. It has some success, at least in creating the groundwork for arms talks. Brezhnev and Nixon signed the SALT Treaty in 1972. Gorbachev and Reagan signed a famous treaty in 1987. So there is an effort there to kind of to control the number of arms and also lay the groundwork for reducing the arms, thereby reducing the chances that some kind of nuclear catastrophe will ensue. And there's a whole debate about whether Reagan's Star Wars plan played a role in that. We'll have to save that one for another talk. To everyone's, again, total surprise, the Berlin Wall begins to crumble in 1989, and that hastens the demise of the Soviet Union, which falls apart 2 years later in 1991.